What's up, everybody? Joe Ringen here, coming to you tonight with another book review. Shocking, I know. Today, hold on. I gotta say, I'm an author. I wrote a book. It's called The Ballad of Ages. It's a tale of epic fantasy. Check it out if you like fantasy and you're looking for something new and you want to try something out. But I'm not here to talk about my book today. I'm here to talk about a different book. It's called Lilith by George MacDonald. So I've been really interested in George MacDonald for a while. It's hard to find his books even in the used bookstores. I mean, you can find them like on eBay and stuff and then Kindle, but hard to find like the physical copy in a used bookstore. I found two George MacDonalds, now that I say that, of course. One at a library sale, and that was kind of like a collection of three of his books. So that was really awesome. I was super stoked to get that one. And then this one I found actually at Half Price Books, believe it or not. I was pretty shocked to find it. But yeah, it's called Lilith. It's one of his more popular books of George MacDonald. And so why am I interested in George MacDonald? You're probably wondering that, right? So the reason I'm interested in George MacDonald is he's often cited and highly regarded by C.S. Lewis and some other people like G.K. Chesterton, but C.S. Lewis is the most well-known person that sings the praises of George MacDonald. And I love C.S. Lewis. I can't get enough of him. And so I'll take his recommendation totally blindly and jump right in. So this also kind of itches another scratch that I have with fantasy books. I really love to find old, sort of not well-known fantasy books or sci-fi books. I love doing that. I think that's the funnest thing. I mean, don't get me wrong. I like new books too. I like Brandon Sanderson. I like, Name of the Wind, stuff like that. I like modern fantasy, but it just seems like there's something different with the older fantasy books that you just hard to find, hard to come by. It's just a different vibe, and I'll get into that more as I go on with this video. But George MacDonald, he's the earliest fantasy book and fantasy author I've read. I mean, I've even read like Lord Dunsany, and I thought that was like super old. And it is, but that's like 1920s. King of Elfland's Daughter. That's his book I read, and I loved it. And it's different than a lot of new fantasy. It's very like, well, that one's really poetic. It's very almost poetry, but the vocabulary is awesome, and the prose is awesome. And I'm not here to talk about Lord Dunsany. I'm here to talk about George MacDonald. So George MacDonald's very much like that, though. He's a Victorian author. And he wrote this book, Lilith, in 1895. That's when it came out. And so it's like, wow, that's that's pretty old. Over 100 years now, and like way older than even Lord of the Rings, which we all think is like that's the beginning of fantasy. Well, I'd argue that's the beginning of modern fantasy, but even Lord of the Rings came from somewhere. Although I don't know if Tolkien actually was into George MacDonald. I know for sure C.S. Lewis was, and you can tell from reading this book, it's a lot that C.S. Lewis is very influenced by George MacDonald. But so I loved it. There are some things that I didn't like, but for the most part, I really loved Lilith, and I for sure love George MacDonald as an author. He's a very interesting guy. I read briefly just a bio. There's actually a book out there written by his son, like a biography, that I'm going to get. I'm sure I can only buy it online. There's like no way I'll find it in his store. But it's called George MacDonald and His Wife, and it just seems very interesting to learn more about him as a person. He was a preacher, like he's like first of all a theologian, like a preacher, and then also a writer. Like he wrote too, but I don't know which one was his main job necessarily. I think preaching was, but he was a great writer, obviously, great imagination, and so he wrote fantasy books too. And when you think about it, which is so cool about George MacDonald, that really drew me to him. As far as I can tell, he's kind of the first person to do that. You think of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and a bunch of others, like newer people, and they're like, they're very smart people. I think they were professors, also like theologians, and then they wrote, but they're very religious. They're very wise in the ways of Christianity, and that plays into their writings, their fantasy books. So, especially Lewis, but like George MacDonald, he wasn't a professor. He was like super poor and like he was like a preacher, and then like I wonder what caused him to say, you know what, I have a lot of these ideas floating in my mind, and I'm gonna extract them and then put them into a fantasy story. Where did that come from? Who gave him that idea? That's what I think that's super interesting. Because like C.S. Lewis, that idea came from George MacDonald. But where did George MacDonald get that idea? So I'm gonna have to keep going back and finding out. Like, are there just a lot of preachers out there that are super nerdy too and into like fantasy, but the thing is, like, fantasy wasn't really like a genre back. I mean, maybe it was, but not as big as it is today. So like, how do you get these ideas of all these crazy things? So that's really interesting to me to learn more about that. So that's George MacDonald. So Lilith, it's one of his better known books, and it's a portal fantasy. So it's very much like Lion the Witch and the Wardrobe, or I should say Lion the Witch and Wardrobe is a lot like this. So the main character, Mr. Vane, he's like a rich old dude. Well, maybe he's not old, but he's like a rich bachelor guy. And in his library, one day he stumbles upon like a magic mirror, and he goes through it, and then now he's in this fantasy world. That's cool. And there's all sorts of crazy creatures that we meet, and landscapes, and giants, and like small people they're called, and like talking cats and stuff. And so it's craziness. I think this this book is kind of like a mix of Christianity and Alice in Wonderland. It's a strange, he just threw everything in the blender. Although I gotta say, this came up before Alice in Wonderland. It's like, I'm not trying to say it's an influence by it, but anyway, it's just like a crazy Christian epic. But I say that too, and like, I don't think you have to be Christian to like this book or religious. I think you would get a lot more out of it if you have foreknowledge of the Bible or Scripture, because there's a lot of symbolism and tips the cap to different parts of Scripture within this book. So you get more out of it, but you don't have to be religious to like this book. I think if you just like fantasy, you will like this book. So the things I loved about it, obviously, was the writing style, the prose. George MacDonald, he's a master of the pen. Like, his understanding and wielding of language is top notch. Great sentences, very musical and poetic. Descriptions of the landscape and the fun creatures and stuff is just, it's top notch. Very good. The other thing I love about it too, and this seems to come with older books like Victorian Age and stuff, there's a lot of philosophy just kind of baked into it. Like when you're not necessarily expecting it, it's just there, which is really, really cool. I love that. It's like a lot of wisdom baked into this book, and you're not necessarily going into it trying to gain wisdom, but you come out of it all the wiser. And that's a tale of a great writer to me. If you can do that, like trick a reader into becoming smarter, I guess, I think that means you're a very good writer. Because who wants to read textbooks? Those are boring. But you can read like fantasy books and learn just as much, probably more. I think it activates a certain part of your brain that textbooks don't. So, and of course, I'm a theology nerd, and there's a lot of cool theology in this too. And so I like that part. And that's part of the story. Like, so the story of Lilith it's a sort of a play on like a Jewish legend. I don't know it exactly. It's exactly where it comes from. I didn't do my research, I guess, but according to this legend, Lilith is is an angel character, and she actually was Adam's first wife. So that's nowhere in the Bible, but that's just according to this legend. And then they have like a child or something, but then Lilith becomes too obsessed with herself or something, and then becomes evil. And Adam ends up getting a second wife, who is Eve. So Eve is his first human wife, but his first wife was Lilith, who's like an angel character. So I don't know all the legend, but that's sort of the gist. But in this book, the main character, Mr. Vane, he goes into this world, and through a lot of different things, he ends up meeting Adam, Lilith, and Eve, and then their daughter. And the whole point of his like quest, so-called quest, is to help Lilith turn from evil back to good, back to God. And the thing is, this book doesn't pull any punches, and that's what I appreciate about it. Is books nowadays, this would be like Christian fiction or something. Like George MacDonald just says this is the world, like God exists, and so, and he uses it, he goes with it. He doesn't pull any punches. God is a character in this, Adam's a character in this, and so he goes with it. And so his quest is to turn Lilith back to God, away from evil, and through it all, he ends up himself turning from evil and becoming a child of God. And so it's a really interesting like fantasy story, and I love books like this where they sort of supplement scripture. And I'm not trying to say like this is divinely inspired again, but it's good to muse on scripture and to think about it in other ways, and this helps keep that in your forefront of your mind. Great. I think that's wonderful. So, and yeah, the themes of this book are deep, and I would think like kids read this book back in the day, and kids must have been very smart back then. I don't think when I was like a kid, I think I would have read this book and be like, "What? This is crazy. I don't understand what's happening." Which kind of that's one of the negatives is I'll go into too. There's a little bit of confusion in this book, but it's very deep. There's a lot of deep themes in philosophy and theology. Like the main theme of this book is really, and Lilith, she keeps fighting and fighting and fighting because she wants to be free. She wants to be free to be herself, free to be who she is and who she wants to be. And so she's perpetually in this state of this weird fantasy world, and she's always tortured, and she just wants to be free. But what ends up they find out is the only way to be truly free is to become a slave to God. And I know, like, if you're coming at this not having read the Bible, you're like, that sounds terrible. Why would I want to be a slave to God? That's like the opposite of freedom. Well, the author does a really good job of explaining it and saying the only way to be actually free is to be a slave of God, because that means you are what you were created to be originally by God, thus free. So if you're always striving to be free to be who you want to be, you're never going to be free. You're going to be a slave to passion and desire and yourself. And so it's sort of a twist on it. And then you think about it, and that actually makes sense. And George MacDonald does a great job of explaining it better than I did. And it's funny, you would never see that theme in any new book today, ever. No publisher would ever take that on. At least like, not a secular publisher. So it's cool. It's kind of refreshing to see that. Even if you don't necessarily believe it, it's cool to see that point of view presented in a good way, in a smart, intelligent, professional way. So then the things I didn't like about this book, I didn't give it a perfect score. I love the writing style and almost everything about it. The things there was, and maybe it's just because it's an old book, I don't know, but there were some things that I just was very confused about, and so I couldn't give it a perfect 100%. Like some of the characters are kind of confusing. There's like Lilith herself, like changes from time to time into like a leopardess, and she like eats little small children or something, and it's terrifying, but it just like I couldn't follow it necessarily. Like, is she a leopardess now? Is she like a person? And then there's also this mysterious princess character, and I'm still kind of confused. Like, is Lilith the princess, or is Lilith's daughter the princess? And also, there's this character called Mara, who's the lady of shadows. So, like, maybe it's just me that I just couldn't keep up with some of these characters and the changes, but usually I can. I read a lot, so I'm totally willing to accept the fault, but I don't know. I just couldn't keep up. So either way, like I didn't give it a perfect score. There was definitely some confusing things to this book. And maybe that's the on purpose, like since it's kind of a wacky fantasy world, maybe it's supposed to be sort of confusing. And I think I'd be able to accept that and be fine with it if that was only the world, but it's very important to know who's talking and like what form they're in, like, so at least to me. So that's why I gave it a 7 out of 10. It's just because it's kind of confusing. But man, the writing style and the wisdom in this book is very good. So if that's your jam, read this book. You will not regret it. So who would like this book? People that like fantasy, but you do have to like sort of the old fantasy, the sort of the high flowery prose. If you just like very quick, to the point short sentences fantasy where you're more interested in the world building and the action sequences, you probably won't like this book. Not a lot of action in this, but if you're like me, who's not necessarily super interested in the action part, more in the philosophical musings or the dialogue, the themes, then yes, you will love this book. Just be prepared to maybe be a little confused at times. So Lilith by George MacDonald. I'm going to definitely get more of George MacDonald's works. Like I said, I have another of his books, like a 3 books in one sort of thing. So I'm going to read those. He also has like theological works where it's just straight up like sermons or something. And so if I can get my hands on those, I'll read those. That's interesting to me. So, and I think it would be very interesting to be able to sit down and just like have a cup of coffee with George MacDonald. And so I think the closest way to do that now, since obviously he's not alive, would be to read his other works, like his sermons and stuff. I think he's a very interesting person. Oh yeah, and I'm gonna get his biography at some point. So Lilith, George MacDonald, 7 out of 10 for me. You might like it more. For sure, I recommend pick it up. That's all for tonight. Until next time, you all have a great night. We'll talk to you later.